Once, in a village wrapped in ivy and superstition, where the fog moved like memory between the trees, a boy and a girl once stood by the stream. She wore a ribbon tied twice in her hair, and he had a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, full of small stones he thought lucky. They were not remarkable, not noble, not learned, but they were in love in the way only the young can be, without plan or permission. Their names, if you ask the baker's wife or the blacksmith's son, were Edric and Alice. But by the time the chroniclers put quill to parchment, their names were forgotten. Only the break between them remained. Their village lay in the shadow of an old priory, and the bells rang every morning not just for mass but for regulation. When the bread must rise, when the gates must close, when children must return to their fathers and girls to their loom work. Time was kept by those bells, but feelings were not. Feelings grew wild like brambles behind the sheep pens, where no one looked. Edric worked the tannery, and the stink of it clung to him no matter how long he washed in the stream. His hands were always rough and brown, too often soaked in lime and lye, his nails rimmed with filth. But Alice never seemed to mind. She would press his fingers between hers as if they were the silks of a far-off city she'd never see. She believed that love was supposed to sting, and maybe that's why she chose him. In those first days, they didn't speak much. They walked. That was enough. The air was often filled with lowing cattle, the soft crackle of charcoal fires, and the murmuring of birds neither had names for. Sometimes, Edric would bring her a piece of carved wood, badly shaped into the form of a bird or a stag. Sometimes, Alice would bring him apple slices she had hidden from her siblings. These were their promises, unspoken, unsealed, and entirely theirs. But time, like water, wears down everything. It began with whispers. Alice's mother had noticed her looking dreamily at nothing while spinning flax. The village priest had noticed her lingering too long in the back pew. And Edric, he began to earn less. The guild had cut wages again. A higher tax was demanded by a lord they'd never seen, and the tannery was not exempt. Alice's father began talking of marrying her to the cooper's son instead, who had his own tools and a promise of inheritance. Her future was being traded like barley grain, and the ribbon in her hair meant little to anyone but her. They began to meet in secret. The meadow at dusk became their chapel, but secrecy curdled their laughter. The weight of hiding dulled the magic. One night, as the wind turned colder, Alice asked very quietly if he would run away with her. Edric hesitated. It was not a loud hesitation, not even a spoken one, just a breath caught too long in his throat, a glance downward, a slow rubbing of his thumb against the callus of his palm. But she saw it, and in that breath, before he even answered, something in her broke. He did say yes eventually, but only after she repeated the question. And by then it wasn't really an answer. It was a concession. And Alice, who wanted to be chosen with fire, heard only the ash. The next morning she didn't appear. Not in the meadow. Not at Massachusetts. Not even at the stream. 3 days passed. On the 4th, the banns were read in church. Alice, daughter of wool merchant Halric, was to be wed to Aldwine, son of coopers and steady hands. Edric stood in the back, alone. The villagers said it was for the best, that it was a good match, that Alice had always deserved a cleaner life. No one mentioned the way Edric stopped talking for a week, or how he walked past the tannery without going in, or how he threw every one of his wooden carvings into the stream where they bobbed like small, drowned animals. The break was not dramatic. There were no letters, no screams, no tearful confessions under moonlight, just the quiet collapse of something invisible, like a spider's web brushed away by wind. In the years to come, they would pass each other. Feast days, at harvests, to funerals. She in fine blue linen, her hair bound high. He in the same work apron, shoulders stooped a little more each season. Sometimes she would look at him, not long, not lingering, but just enough that he would feel the warmth of old words rising in his throat like unfinished songs. He would never speak to her again, but every year on the third Sunday of Lent, he would carve a bird, just one, and leave it by the stream beneath the stone where they first sat together. It was never taken, but it was never there the next day either. There were other stories too, quiet, heavy ones that floated through towns like low smoke from the hearth. Not every love ended in silence. Some were dragged into the open, where bishops frowned and papers were drawn, and where hearts were not only broken but documented. In the year of our Lord 1273, in a walled town where the market square clattered with hooves and heavy gossip, there lived a woman named Isabel. Her eyes were pale as barley, and her voice low, almost humming when she spoke. Her husband, though once beloved, had grown bitter with age and ambition. Sir Gervas, a man with sharp opinions and a thirst for coin. When they were first wed, the whole parish had turned out to watch her walk the aisle. A velvet circlet sat on her brow, and beneath her veil, the hope of youth flickered. She had thought it would be simple, that love, once pronounced by priest and witnessed by Christ, would anchor them against the world. But no wedding vow could tether a soul that wished to drift. By their third year, he no longer looked at her, not with warmth, not even with anger, just as one regards a familiar pot or the wooden bench at the foot of the bed. She knew he had begun visiting the tavern maid with the dimpled smile and the swinging walk. Everyone knew. No one said. Isabel didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked, every morning, alone through the orchard paths, down to the shrine by the old yew tree. There, she lit a small candle and sat in the frost-bitten silence. She prayed, but not for him to return. She prayed for herself to become invisible, or transformed into a bird that could fly beyond the town walls. But prayers often go unanswered when they threaten the order of things. She finally did what few dared. She sought annulment. It was not easy, nor quiet. A woman asking to undo her own marriage was an offense to many, not just to her husband. The priest furrowed his brow and muttered about sacred duty. The bishop's man, sent from the city, took notes with a quill too sharp and eyes too narrow. But she spoke, clearly and plainly, of neglect, of abandonment, of a marriage that had dried like a fig left too long in the sun. Gervas laughed. He accused her of coldness, of being barren, of cursing his name, and still she did not weep. She stood in the chapter hall, her hands wrapped in the sleeves of her modest gown, and said only, "I was not made to be unloved." It was a hard case. The church was slow and suspicious. But eventually, months later, the word was handed down. Annulment granted. The marriage was as though it had never been. But nothing in life is truly erased. She moved to a smaller house at the edge of town. It was not much, bare walls, a crooked hearth, a garden full of brambles. But it was hers. Her name was whispered now with both admiration and pity. Some women looked at her and smiled in secret, as if she had walked through fire and come out shining. Others crossed themselves, fearing the boldness might be catching. Gervas remarried within a year, to the same tavern maid. She bore him 3 children and never once asked for freedom. Isabel watched them from her garden gate, face unreadable, breath held. Yet on some days, when the wind moved just right through the orchard paths, she walked again. Not to pray, but to listen, to the leaves, to her own steps, to the stillness she had bought with pain. She grew herbs, not to sell but to tend. She dried lavender in bundles and tucked it into her sleeves. She read psalms by candlelight, even the ones about sorrow, especially those. And when the festival of St. Agnes came each winter, she walked to the church and stood in the back pew, eyes closed, humming her quiet tune. Not for anyone, just to herself, for the girl she had once been, and for the woman she had chosen to become. Heartbreak in medieval Europe was not always the story of a boy and girl by a stream. Sometimes it was legal, loud, carved into record books and argued in courtrooms. But beneath all that, beneath the ink and judgment and whispers, there was always someone like Isabel, wrapping her bruised soul in silence and starting over. The church may have annulled her past, but she never truly forgot it. Nor did she wish to. Pain was part of her. It became her lacework, her breath, her legend. There are many who say women of the Middle Ages were passive, trapped, voiceless. But that is only half a truth. Some, like Isabel, used the only tools they had: patience, prayer, defiance without noise. And in doing so, they carved out space. Not loudly, but fully. If you walk near the orchard now, there is no shrine, no candle, only wind. But sometimes at dusk you can smell lavender where none grows. The river near did not move quickly, but it moved without rest. It wound around fields stitched in barley and wheat, past mills that turned with a slow, heavy sigh. And beside one such mill, where the water slapped the stones like a lullaby, two young hearts once stood, pledging what they could not yet understand. Her name was Maud. His was Alaric. He was the miller's apprentice, bare-armed and dusted with flour, and she was the daughter of a baker who sang as she kneaded dough. They did not have letters between them or the luxury of gifts, but what they gave was time. Long pauses after chores were done, glances stolen during the Feast of the Assumption, hands brushing briefly as grain sacks passed between them. Their love was not loud, but it grew strong in the quiet. It began in midsummer. Maud had twisted a crown of daisies and placed it on her head as a joke. Alaric had laughed, but his eyes lingered too long. That evening, he carved a circle into the wood of the mill-house door. A simple wreath of flowers, no initials, just a quiet echo of what he'd seen. From then on, every time she passed it, she smiled. He asked to court her, not with poetry or fanfare, but with a basket of warm rolls left at her doorstep at dawn. She never asked how he woke so early. She just left an apple on the path the next day. Their understanding grew like ivy, clinging, reaching, silent. But the years turned, and one autumn, just as the leaves began to crumple at the edges, a summons arrived for Alaric. The lord of the region was raising men for service. The king's armies needed numbers for a campaign in the south. Young, unland men were easy choices. He was to leave within 10 days. When he told her, they stood by the millstone, the same one they had walked past 100 times. The river moved behind them, unbothered. A bird sang somewhere in the hedgerow. But around them, the world had grown very still. "I'll come back," he said. "It won't be long." She nodded, but her mouth stayed closed. 2 seasons, maybe 3, he added, as if cutting time into something manageable. Still she said nothing. He stepped closer and took a ribbon from his sleeve. It was pale green, something she had tied in her braid once, then forgotten. He had kept it, though she'd never noticed. "I'll wear it," he said, "beneath my shirt, close to the heart." Then finally Maud spoke. "And if you forget me?" His brow furrowed. "I'd sooner forget my own name." She almost smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just promise me one thing," she whispered. "If you come back, don't call for me at the mill." He blinked. "Why not?" "Because I won't be there," she said. "Unless you mean to stay." He nodded, but she didn't believe him. Not really. Not yet. He left 2 days later with 30 others. The village watched them go, sons, brothers, boys still too thin to carry a sword. Some carried wooden shields. Some kissed mothers. A few cried when they thought no one looked. Alaric looked back only once, and Maud wasn't there. She had gone to the woods. She told herself it was to gather mushrooms, but she found none. Only fallen leaves and the distant sound of hooves. She sat on a log for a long time, the earth cold through her dress, her fingers twisting into her apron until the stitching nearly tore. Time began to stretch. Seasons passed like doors swinging open and shut. The baker's oven burned daily. The mill kept turning. But Maud drifted through the motions like someone wading through a deep, still pond. Her laugh grew soft, her singing less frequent. At night, she lay in bed and counted the breaths between church bells. 1 year passed, then another. No letter came, no word, no Alaric. They told her he'd likely gone to Gascony or Provence, where men often did not return. Maybe he'd married, maybe he'd died, or perhaps he was simply delayed. But the maybes began to weigh on her shoulders like sacks of flour. The not knowing was worse than any truth. So when Bertrand, the brewer's son, asked for her hand, she didn't say yes out of love. She said yes out of mercy, to stop the questions, to stop waiting. He was kind, gentle in the way of those who've known sorrow. He made no grand promises, and perhaps that's why she chose him. She no longer believed in grand promises. The wedding was quiet. Her father wept with joy. Her sister braided her hair with rosemary. She smiled for the guests, but her heart stood somewhere else, beside the millstone, beneath the autumn wind. 5 months later, Alaric returned. He came limping into town with mud on his boots and a faded ribbon tied at his wrist. The same green one. He had been wounded, taken captive, escaped, spent a season in a monastery recovering, then walked the rest of the way home. He went to the mill. She was not there. When he asked, the miller told him plainly, "She's married now, to Bertrand. They live near the orchard wall." Alaric didn't speak, just turned, walked back to the river, and sat beside the old millstone until the sky turned violet. He placed the ribbon on the stone and pressed it flat with his palm. He did not cry, not where anyone could see. Maud saw him once months later, at market. He didn't see her, or if he did, he made no sign. That night, she walked to the mill alone and found the ribbon still there, pressed beneath a smooth stone. She sat beside it, placed her hand over it, and whispered his name into the wind. Not to call him, but to let him go. In the highlands of northern England, where the wind seemed always to speak through the heather and the stones, there stood a manor once warm with fires, now quiet with memory. Its hearth still held ashes, and its tapestries hung faded along the walls, but the woman who walked its corridors did so in silence. Her name was Lady Eleonora, and she was no longer young. Her husband, Sir Wulfric, had died 5 winters past, and with his passing, the music had stopped. He had not been a cruel man, nor overly kind. Their union had been arranged when she was just 16, and he near twice her age. He had spoken little in their early years, offering her a jewel now and then, a cloak in winter, a wordless glance across the table. She had grown used to his presence the way one grows used to a tree outside the window, always there, unmoving, neither beloved nor resented. Yet his absence startled her. The day they buried him, the sky was iron. The priest said words she barely heard. The servants wept more than she did. She stood like stone, her veil brushing her cheeks as the wind pulled at it gently, as if even the weather wanted to lift her grief. But grief did not arrive in loud bursts for Eleonora. Came in long silences, in forgotten echoes, in the creak of floorboards untouched, in the absence of his boots by the fire. People assumed she would remarry. She had no children, and her dowry had been generous. Her hair was still long and ungrayed, her hands unlined but careful. Suitors came, distant barons with empty halls, merchants hoping for noble names, priests suggesting retreat into a convent. She refused them all. "I am content," she would say, but she was not. She simply preferred loneliness to repetition. There had been a man once before Wulfric. His name had been Hal, a stable boy's son. They had met under the eaves of the kitchen house, their hands stained with berry juice, their laughter buried behind hedges. He had shown her how to whistle with acorn caps. She had given him a small carved charm from her mother's sewing box. They had loved as only children do, boldly, without fear of tomorrow. But tomorrow came, and with it the promise of marriage to a nobleman. Her father had forbidden the friendship. Hal was sent to another estate. The charm was never returned. Still, for a while, she had remembered him. In dreams, in the smell of horses, in the whistle of wind through old wood. And when Wulfric placed a ring on her hand, she wore it without protest, but also without joy. Years passed. The ring dulled. Her hair lengthened. She bore no children. Wulfric did not seem to mind. They dined, they prayed, they nodded politely. She never asked about Hal again. Until one winter, a trader from the western shires had arrived with mules loaded with spice and fabric. He was older, with a slow gait and a scar at his jaw. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long when they met in the great hall. After supper, he asked to speak with her alone. In the chapel, beneath the stone saints, he handed her a small bundle wrapped in wool. Inside, a charm, wooden, worn, and shaped like a bird in flight. "I believe this once belonged to you," he said. "I found it among my brother's things." His name was Hal. The world tilted. She did not cry, but her hand trembled as she touched it. "He is gone. 2 years now," the man replied, peacefully. But near his end, he always spoke of a girl with sunlight in her hair. He said he never stopped thinking of her. She stood there, the charm pressed to her chest, as the candle flames flickered. She did not say his name aloud. She did not speak at all. After the trader left, she kept the charm beside her bed. She began to walk the manor again, not in silence, but humming softly. She reopened the southern rooms, long shuttered. She swept the garden paths herself. She read psalms in the evenings, not as ritual, but with feeling. And on the coldest nights, when the stars were sharp as splinters, she would light a single candle in the chapel and place the bird charm beneath it. Not to pray, just to remember. There was no reunion, no return, just the knowledge that someone once had loved her wholly. That somewhere, far from stone and duty, her name had been spoken with warmth. That was enough. She never married again. The villagers called her the widow of Light Hall. Some pitied her, others admired her. But none knew her story. They only saw a woman who walked with calm, whose eyes were bright despite sorrow, who sang to herself as she trimmed the yew hedge. When she died, many years later, the charm was found still in her hand. They buried it with her. And now, in the ruins of that manor, long claimed by ivy and moss, there is still said to be a room that stays warm in winter. And sometimes, if you listen, the faint sound of humming beneath the wind. In the city of Rouen, where the stone streets curved like memory and the bells rang differently depending on who had died or been born, a woman stood before a tribunal of churchmen with her hands folded over a silken girdle. Her name was Juliet, and she was not from nobility, but her face was known in many corners of the city, at the herb market, at the lace booth, at the candle seller's stall on the south side of the square. She had been married for 6 years to a man named Henri, a man who had once seemed thoughtful and scholarly. His hair always combed, his tunic well kept, his speech clean as a priest's. He came from a family of merchants, and he often spoke of trade, of coin, of opportunities in far-off ports. He said their match was divinely timed. He kissed her hand when they met. He told her she was clever, but kindness wears thin when pressed too often. By the 2nd year of marriage, Henri had become absent in every way a man could be while still occupying space. He would leave without telling her where. He would eat without tasting. When she spoke, he did not answer. When she touched his sleeve, he flinched. When she lit candles in their small chapel and asked him to kneel beside her, he claimed he was too tired to pray. And then the rumors came that he had a second home in a different quarter of the city, that he sent coin to a woman with 2 children in Dieppe, that he drank in taverns meant for sailors and forgot to come home at all. She tried not to believe them, but disbelief cannot stretch forever. Juliet was not a dramatic woman. Her voice never rose. Her words were never many. But one morning in winter, just before Candlemas, she rose from her bed, dressed in her best wool, and walked to the bishop's court. She carried a book of psalms and a single handkerchief stitched by her mother. She requested an annulment, caused a stir. Such things always did. The court asked for witnesses, for evidence, for testimonies. Henri denied nothing, but he laughed, softly, bitterly, as if to say, "Let her waste her breath." His family was embarrassed. Hers was furious. Her mother wept. Her brother accused her of shameful pride. But Juliet never faltered. "My body," she said to the bishop, "has not been cherished. My spirit has not been seen. I walk beside a man who does not know me, and I feel I am already a widow." There were murmurs, but the bishop, old and slow and too tired to argue, listened. The process took months. Letters were written, witnesses called. A neighbor testified that Henry's boots were never muddy from work. A seamstress said he often bought perfume, not for Juliet, who never wore any. A boy swore he saw him kiss a woman in a red hood by the river docks. When the final judgment was read aloud, the bishop spoke without flourish. "This union," he said, "is not sacramental in truth, though it may be so in law. Therefore, let it be rendered void." She did not weep, nor smile, only bowed her head. Henri left the city soon after. Where he went no one knew. She did not ask. Juliet returned to her small house near the garden wall. The lace sellers still greeted her. The candle merchant gave her 3 for the price of 2. Some whispered, but most did not speak of it aloud. Life continued in the slow spiral it always had. But something in her changed. She began to write. Small things first, phrases in the margins of her psalter. Lines of poetry copied from travelers' books. Then stories. Quiet tales of women who vanished into forests and reemerged with silver hair. Of girls who built ships in dreams and sailed across mist. Of queens who wore veils not to hide, but to sharpen their sight. She never showed them to anyone. They lived in a carved box beneath her bed, tied with ribbon, scented with rosemary. Yet when she walked through the city, people said she glowed, that her eyes were like evening, soft, but holding light. One evening, years later, a man came to her door. He was gentle-spoken, older, with a limp in his right leg. He said he remembered her from the bishop's court. He had been a clerk then. He said he had admired her courage, even from behind a desk. He brought with him a gift. A book of Latin poetry, its spine worn, its pages full of handwritten notes in the margin. "I thought you might like it," he said. "You always seemed like someone who listens closely." She invited him to stay for tea. They spoke of many things, but not of Henri, not of old wounds, not of courts or coins or judgment, just of language and light, and the way pigeons seemed to favor the cathedral roof. He visited again the next week, and again after that. She never remarried, but she began to write more stories, and now they included someone with a limp, someone who listened, someone who knew how to remain silent without vanishing. And when Candlemas came each year, she lit 2 candles instead of 1. One for the freedom she fought for, and one for the peace she found after. He was called Brother Thomas by the time she saw him again, but once, long ago, he had been simply Tom. No robe, no vow, no soft leather sandals tied tight with humility. Just a boy who knew how to run without shoes, who laughed with his whole chest, and who called her name like it belonged only to him. They had grown up together on the edge of a wide marshland where cranes moved like spirits and the mist never fully lifted until noon. Her name was Beatrice. She was the Reeves' daughter, clever with numbers and never afraid of blood. Tom was the carpenter's 3rd son, born without inheritance but full of hunger, for sky, for river, for things not yet written. As children, they built towers of river stones and dared each other to walk the highest beams of new barns. She once fell and broke a tooth. He carried her home on his back, silent the whole way. When they grew older, words became more scarce. But glances grew longer. A touch on the wrist lasted an extra heartbeat. Once, she found a ribbon of hers tucked inside his Bible, badly hidden, pressed between the Psalms and Proverbs. He never said the word marriage. But once, after helping to hoist hay into the loft, hands blistered and cheeks sunburnt, he sat beside her under the blackthorn tree and said, "If I had land and means, I would build you a house, not large, but warm, and you'd never want for anything." She had not replied. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the sky went violet. But winter came hard that year. With snow came hunger, and with hunger came silence. His father, seeing no dowry on the horizon and too many mouths to feed, sent Tom to the monks. It was the safest thing, the surest thing. The monastery took boys like him, smart, obedient, steady with their hands. He would eat, he would pray, he would survive. She had watched him walk away with the monks, his hair freshly shaved at the crown. He never looked back, but her gaze followed him until the trees swallowed his shape. Years passed. Beatrice did not marry. Suitors came. Some brought goats. One brought a small gold ring. She turned them all away. Her father stopped asking after the third harvest. Her mother said little, but sometimes left bread by her door when Beatrice forgot to eat. She worked. She helped birth calves. She sang when she thought no one listened. And she walked by the monastery wall more often than she meant to. There was a small opening where water spilled out from within. She told herself it was coincidence. One Lent, word spread. The abbey would open for public Massachusetts. A rare event, part of some long-forgotten holy observance. She rose early, braided her hair, and wore her cleanest wool. She carried no ribbon. Inside the nave, the scent of wax and lavender hung in the cold air. Candles burned. Robed brothers moved in rows like reeds in wind. Then she saw him, older, paler, but unmistakably him. His face had changed, leaner now, carved by prayer and hunger. But the eyes were the same. They passed over the crowd once, landed on her, and stopped. He blinked. She did not. After Mass, she waited near the old yew tree outside the cloister. The wind tugged gently at her shawl. The bells told none. Her hands, folded in front of her, trembled slightly. He came. "Beatrice," he said, quietly. "I wasn't sure if it was you," she lied. He smiled, just faintly. "I knew you'd come." They stood in silence. It wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had too much to say and no language to carry it. Finally, he looked up. "I see your eyes in dreams," he said. "Even when I fast. Even when I try not to. I see your hands," she whispered. "Carving, hammering. Not praying." "I still build things," he said. "Benches, altars, shelves. It helps." "You never wrote," she said. "I wasn't allowed." She nodded. "I used to make up letters from you. Then I stopped." He lowered his eyes. "I would have written if I could. Every day." They spoke of small things after that. Of their village. Of old names. Of how the marsh hadn't changed. At last, she asked, "Do you regret it?" His eyes filled with mist. "I don't regret the vow," he said. "But I regret what it cost." She didn't cry, but she folded her arms tighter around herself. "Do you think of me? Every time I touch wood. Every time I smell rushes. Every time the wind changes direction. I thought," she said, "I'd hate you for leaving, but I never managed to. I thought I'd forget you," he said, "but I didn't." The bell tolled again. He flinched. "I have to go," he said. "We sing at Sext." She stepped forward. "Is there a place? Some way I could see you again? Without seeing you?" He hesitated. Then, "The cloister wall. Third window from the east. Sometimes I read there after Compline." She nodded. "I won't disturb you. You never could." She turned, walking away without looking back. But she felt his eyes on her until the monastery door closed behind him. That night, just before the last light faded from the sky, she walked past the wall. And there it was, a single flickering flame behind the third window. Not bright, not bold, but there. She returned the next evening, and the one after. She never knocked, never called, never entered, but every time she walked past, there was a candle, and every time he lit it, he remembered the girl under the blackthorn tree, the one who never asked for anything, and to whom he gave everything he could not keep. The castle walls were gray with age, their battlements softened by moss and decades of wind. Within them, in a high chamber with windows carved like slender ribs of stone, sat a woman once crowned before thousands. Her name was Queen Isabeau, but no one called her that anymore, not aloud. The pages addressed her as "My Lady." The guards nodded without speaking. And the king, well, the king no longer visited at all. She had been chosen, as many queens were, for alliances inked in quiet chambers. At 17, she had been told to pack her linen and smile as if love had bloomed overnight. She did. Her father kissed her brow and said nothing. Her mother tied a charm of rosemary and silk to her wrist and whispered, "They can take your name, but don't let them take your memory." The wedding had been grand. Trumpets, torches, pearls sewn into her veil. Her new husband, King Guillaume, was tall and clever, with eyes too sharp for softness. He spoke to her with polished phrases, offered her gifts from distant lands, and asked if she liked hunting. She said yes, though she didn't. Queens must like what their kings like. First, all was pageant. She bore him a son in her second year, and a daughter the next. She thought this meant permanence. But in courts, even blood could turn thin. He grew distant. Letters appeared in foreign script, brought by couriers cloaked in blue. Advisors whispered more than they spoke. She heard her name less and the name of another more. A lady with soft hands and fewer opinions. A lady whose laugh did not echo in council chambers. A lady from the south with vineyards in her dowry. When the invitation came for that woman to visit the royal gardens, Isabeau knew. Queens are not dismissed with swords. They are erased with smiles and ceremonies. The king called her to the chapel one evening. The stone glowed golden in the candlelight. She waited in silence while he shifted on the wooden bench beside her. "I have prayed," he said, "and spoken with the bishop." She said nothing. "There is cause for annulment. You are, as they say, a good woman. But not," he paused, "not my true match." Still she said nothing. The silence settled thick between them. "The kingdom needs peace," he said. "She brings land, coin, alliances. You understand." "I understand," she said softly. "You want to replace me with someone quieter." He looked away. They annulled the marriage by Easter. The court changed overnight. Her rooms were moved to the east wing. Her ladies-in-waiting reassigned. Her children, now titled heirs of the realm, were entrusted to court tutors and kept from her chambers unless summoned. She was not exiled. That would have been cruel. Instead, they called it a gracious relocation, a gift of privacy, a retreat. The walls of her new rooms were colder. The hearth smoked. The tapestries bore faded saints she did not recognize. But there was a window that faced the hills, and in the far distance, if the morning fog was light, she could see the chapel where she had once spoken her vows. She lit a candle there each dawn, not for the king, not even for her children, but for herself. To remember, years passed. The new queen walked the gardens with practiced serenity. She smiled. She bore sons. She played the lute poorly, but the court praised her modesty, her softness, her virtue. Isabeau watched without bitterness. She had learned that queens were like garments, chosen for season, then folded away. But she wrote. In secret, by the small lamp on her desk, she kept a ledger, not of accounts, but of memory. She wrote down everything the king had ever said to her. His words, his pauses, his silences. She recorded what she had worn the day they met, what his hand felt like in winter, how he had once carved a bird from walnut wood and left it by her bed. She did not write to wound. She wrote so she would not forget herself. One day, a young page came to her with an envelope sealed in blue wax. Inside was a letter from her daughter. It was not long, perhaps 20 lines. But it began with, "To my mother, whom I remember." She wept for the first time in years. Later, when her son came of age, he visited her without guards. He kissed her hand and said, "I know who you are." That night, she added new pages to her ledger, not of grief but of return. She grew older. Her hair turned to silver. The court forgot her, but the castle walls did not. The window still opened toward the chapel. The candle still flickered in the mornings. And sometimes, when visitors passed through and asked who lived in the East Wing, the steward would say, "An old noblewoman, very quiet, writes in the mornings." But among the servants a different name remained, the Silent Queen. She was 16 when they gave her away. No veil, no procession, just a white shift, too thin for November, and a ring that didn't fit. Her name was Isolde, and her home was a manor house so close to the northern border that on some nights she could hear the other kingdom's bells drifting on the wind. Her father was a knight who had risen through war, not titles. He held land by favor, not birth, and favors could vanish. A poor harvest, a careless word, an insult at the wrong feast, and everything they had built would turn to smoke. So he struck a bargain, a husband for his daughter, a man older than him even, a baron with teeth like ivory and eyes the color of a dying fire. He had lost 2 wives already, both sickly, they said. His lands were broad, his loyalty uncertain. The king wanted him pacified. Marriage was the softest sword. Isolde was quiet by nature. She did not argue. When they told her she would leave before Michaelmas, she nodded. When they showed her the gown, she traced the hem in silence. When her mother kissed her forehead, she felt her lips tremble, but said nothing. She rode to her new home with only one maid and a priest. The baron's castle was older than scripture. Its stone was black with age, its halls damp with the breath of ghosts. Servants moved like mice, quick and wordless. A tapestry of St. Margaret hung above her bed, but her face had faded into shadow. He greeted her with wine and silence. The wedding was done in a chapel that smelled of dust and salt. He did not kiss her. He only nodded to the priest, turned, and left. She followed. The days passed in chill and shadow. He rose early, rode out, returned late. He spoke little. He never struck her, but neither did he see her. At dinner, he would eat in silence while she counted the cuts in the wood of the long table. At night, he would undress slowly, methodically, as if preparing for sleep were a kind of strategy. He did not force himself on her, but neither did he ask. And in that space between dread and detachment, she wilted like parchment left in rain. But the castle had a library, small, neglected, dusty. The key had been misplaced years ago, but she found it in a drawer of spoons. Inside were books in Latin and French, a few in the old tongue, and some so eaten by mice that they crumbled at the touch. But she did not touch. She read with her eyes alone, devouring pages in silence, as if the words might stitch her soul back together. One afternoon she found a map. Not a royal map, not a battle map, but a pilgrim's chart, drawn by hand with notes in the margin. "Avoid this path, the wolves here do not fear fire," and "This bridge, though broken, still holds the weight of hope." She began to dream, not wild dreams, quiet ones. A horse, a cloak, a path through the forest lit by moonlight. Her maid, Elaine, was younger than her by 2 years but had eyes like flint. One evening, as Isolde stared at the map again, Elaine said softly, "You don't have to stay." Isolde turned. "I am his wife. You are not his prisoner. But if I leave, I'll shame my father, ruin the match. Then let him be ruined." Isolde shook her head. "There's nowhere to go. There's always somewhere. And she believed her. Over the next weeks they planned. Slowly, quietly, a loaf of bread wrapped in linen, a pair of boots taken from the cellar, a bit of coin sewn into her sleeve, and the map copied carefully onto parchment in her own hand. They chose a night when the moon was thin and the wind loud. She left no note, only the ring, placed on the table beside the untouched wine. They rode 2 villages over before dawn caught them. The Baron sent riders, but not far. It was winter, the roads were hard, and perhaps he didn't care enough to chase her himself. Isolde never returned. She took a new name, not to hide but to begin. She lived for a time in a convent, then in the home of a widow who taught her to spin. Later, she found work copying manuscripts. She wrote with a slow, steady hand and often left messages in the margins. Small things like, "Let her be free," or even "Stone breaks under rain." Years passed. She never married again. She didn't need to. She walked under stars without fear. She sang when she chopped wood. She read aloud to girls who had never heard stories before. She told no one of the Baron. But when she lit candles in the chapel, she sometimes whispered her name, her real one, just so it would not vanish. Isolde, the girl from the borderlands, the girl who left before she became ash. They met when they were still young enough to believe the world would wait for them. He was a mason's apprentice, hands always caked with lime, arms strong from lifting stone. She was the daughter of a town scribe, always ink-stained and half-listening to stories as she swept the shop floor. Their lives were measured in different weights. His by hammer and chisel, hers by feathered quill and soft parchment. But love, in those days, was not so much chosen as discovered. Like stumbling upon a spring in the woods, unexpected but clear. His name was Corwin. Hers was Elena. They met at the town well. She dropped a bucket. He caught it before it cracked. Their eyes met. She smiled. He laughed. That was all. By the end of the month, they met twice a week. By the end of the season, every day. They carved out a space for themselves between obligations. An hour behind the grain mill. A stolen moment in the church garden. He would bring stones to show her. Smooth, odd-colored, veined with silver. She brought poems. Mostly hers. Some old. Some written just for him. He carved her name into the underside of a chapel bench. She pressed his into the corner of a page in her journal, then folded it shut and hid it in her apron. When he asked for her hand, her father hesitated. "A mason's boy?" he asked, but not unkindly. "You could marry a clerk, a baker at least." "I don't want flour," she replied. "I want stone, something that lasts." The wedding was simple, just families, bread, and wine. The priest read the Psalms twice by mistake. Everyone laughed. They lived in a rented room above the candlemaker's shop. It smelled of wax and smoke, but it had a window. At night, they would sit on the floor, her back against his chest, and they would dream aloud. "3 children," he said once. "4," she corrected. "And a garden." He kissed her ear. "And a porch." And she added, "With a rocking chair." But dreams don't guard against the summons of war. When the bells rang, they echoed down every narrow street. The crown demanded men. Not just soldiers, but builders, men who could raise siege towers, dig trenches, reinforce walls. Corwin's name was taken down. He held her as she wept. "I'll write," he promised, "every week. And I'll reply," she whispered, "every day if they let me." They kissed under a gray sky, his pack heavy, her fingers cold. And then he was gone. She waited for the first letter. It arrived 3 weeks later. Mud-smeared, half-torn, but in his hand. "My Elena," it read, "I built a rampart today and thought of your spine. How strong it is, how it curves when you stretch at dawn." She laughed and cried at once. She read it 10 times. She wrote back the same day, folded the page with rosemary. sealed it with wax she borrowed from the candle shop. The second letter came 6 weeks later. I have a cough, but it's nothing. Tell me about the leaves. Have they turned? She replied with a pressed maple leaf tucked inside. Then silence. Weeks, then months. No word. The town scribe's daughter became the woman who walked to the post station every market day. Some said he was dead. Others whispered desertion. A few claimed the war had moved too far to send letters home. But she did not believe them. Instead, she wrote. Every week. She told him about the candle shop's new apprentice who burned himself. About the cat that gave birth in their laundry bin. About the robin that returned too early and died in the frost. She wrote as if he were beside her. She kept the letters in a box under their bed. Sealed. Unsent. Waiting. 2 years passed. She moved out of the room above the candle shop. Too many memories. Too much smoke. She took a smaller place near the river. She opened a reading house for women and girls. She read them old ballads and taught them how to sign their names. But she still walked to the post station every market day, just in case. On the third spring after his departure, a traveler arrived. Dusty, lame in one leg, he asked for Elena by name. She found him at the inn. You're Corwin's? He asked gently. She nodded. He lowered his eyes. I was with him, for a while. He was hurt, in the leg. We left him in a village by the forest edge. He said he'd come home once he could walk. She clutched the table. But he never made it? I don't know. I left. I had to. But he gave me this. He handed her a piece of slate. Her name was carved into it, rough but deep. Beneath it, always. She wept, but not because of loss, because he had remembered her in stone. Years passed. She never remarried. She kept the slate by her window, beside a candle she lit each dusk. She stopped writing letters, but she never burned the ones she had. They remained, bound in twine, like a book no one else could read. Elena became known as the woman who taught others to write, even if they had nothing to say. But she had said it all, to him, and she still believed, even after all those years, that one day he would return. Not as a soldier, not as a husband, but as the boy who caught her bucket at the well, and smiled. They had grown up like roots tangled beneath the same soil. Agneta and Lisbeth, daughters of the same village, born weeks apart, swaddled in the same wool, fed by the same goats. From childhood, they had shared everything. Ribbons, secrets, even scoldings. Where one went, the other followed. At harvest dances, they laughed in rhythm. At funerals, they held hands and didn't let go. Lisbeth was the brave one. She climbed trees barefoot and shouted back at old men who pinched too hard at market. Agneta was quieter, but sharp-eyed. She could spot a sick lamb before it stumbled, and knew which herbs made a birth easier or a heartbreak softer. They were not sisters by blood, but in a village like theirs that meant very little. What mattered was who carried your sorrow without asking. In their 16th summer, Agneta realized she loved Lisbeth in a way no one had taught her was possible. It wasn't a sudden revelation, just a slow dawning. A smile that lingered too long. A touch that meant too much. The ache in her chest when Lisbeth kissed a red-haired boy behind the mead cart. The way her body felt like it had forgotten how to breathe. She never told her. Instead, she stayed beside her, braiding her hair, picking out splinters, grinding herbs in the quiet hours. Lisbeth married the red-haired boy. His name was Joran, and he wasn't cruel, just loud and quick to anger. He loved Lisbeth in the way boys are taught to love. Possessive, hungry, certain. Agneta did not go to the wedding. She claimed she was tending to a difficult birth in the next village. It was only half a lie, but her absence was noticed. Lisbeth visited less after that. Joran didn't like her, said Agneta filled his wife's head with too many ideas, that she stirred the old magic too much, that her fingers smelled too much of herbs and independence. Still, Lisbeth came when she could. "I miss when things were simple," she whispered once, as Agneta helped her tie on a shawl. "They were never simple," Agneta said gently. "Just smaller." Lisbeth smiled. "You always say the right thing." But one spring, Lisbeth stopped visiting altogether. No explanation, no quarrel, just silence. Agneta asked after her in the village square. A shrug here, a downturned glance there. "She's busy," they said. "Married life keeps her tired." But Agneta felt the shift like a draft in an old room. Something had changed. The summer passed with no word. Then came the harvest, and with it, blood. Joran was found near the river, drunk, beaten, half-drowned. He raged of betrayal, of witches, of a wife who defied him. And Lisbeth, gone, vanished in the night, with nothing but a bag of dried bread and the shoes Agneta had once made her. The village whispered that she'd run off with a merchant, that she'd drowned herself, that the old gods had taken her. Agneta said nothing, but she began to walk further from home, into the woods, past the hills, toward the border towns. She asked no questions, but she listened to every rumor. In a mountain village weeks away, she heard of a woman with golden hair who delivered babies with hands like silk. "She doesn't speak much," they said, "but she sings to the newborns." Agneta found her in a stone cottage at the forest's edge. Lisbeth, older, leaner, but her. Their eyes met like thunderclouds. No words, just the breaking of years in a single breath. Lisbeth stepped forward. Her voice was rougher now. "I didn't know if you'd come. You could have written. I didn't know how to begin." Agneta held her gaze. "Begin with why?" Lisbeth exhaled. "He struck me, not just once." And the village looked away. Agneta's jaw tightened. "And you?" she asked. "I missed you until it hurt," Lisbeth said. "But I thought maybe it would be kinder if I vanished." "Kinder to whom?" "To you, to me, to the ache between us." Silence. Then Agneta stepped closer. "I loved you. I know. Still do." Lisbeth's eyes welled. "I never stopped." They did not kiss. Not that day. But Lisbeth made tea, and Agneta mended the window latch that whistled in the wind. They shared bread, shared silence. Agneta stayed a week, then 2, then forever. No ceremony, no proclamation, just 2 women growing herbs, catching babies, laughing at the fire. The village came to trust them, one with healing hands, one with songs that soothed screaming lungs. They became known as the midwives of the Pine Hollow. But sometimes, in the hush before dawn, Lisbeth would press her face into Agneta's shoulder and whisper, "I'm sorry I left." And Agneta would answer, "You came back, and that was enough." The house was stone, cold, grand, wrapped in ivy and legacy. It stood at the edge of a wind-struck moor, where even the sheep moved carefully, and thunder could be heard long before it broke. Inside that house lived a man named Edric, Viscount of Linmere. Tall, quiet. His hands bore no calluses, but his eyes had the look of someone who had grieved more than once. He hosted no feasts, gave no airs. He was known to walk alone after supper, past the hedge line, where the lanterns did not reach. The servants said he had once been in love, but no one knew her name, only that she had not become his wife, and that something in him had been buried with her absence. Long ago, long before titles, before duties, before the stone house on the moor, Edric had been just a second son, sent to study numbers and Latin in a city of old bridges and crowded chapels. There, among scrolls and flickering lamps, he met her, Mara. She was the daughter of a foreign ambassador, raised in 6 cities and fluent in more tongues than she had fingers. She laughed like she wasn't supposed to. She read the Psalms aloud as if they were love poems. She played chess badly, but always insisted on being white. They met by accident. She dropped a book, and he picked it up. He returned it with a blush. She thanked him with a grin. They became inseparable. She showed him the corners of the city he hadn't noticed. The weaver's market where the silk was dyed violet. The bakery that sold honey cakes only at dusk. He taught her the names of stars and constellations, and the Latin root of the word hope. They fell in love the way some people fall asleep. Slowly, then all at once. In late summer, he asked if she would wait for him. His brother had died unexpectedly, and with it, the weight of inheritance fell on Edric's shoulders. "I have to go home," he told her, "but I'll come back for you. Before winter." She cupped his face with both hands. "If you promise," she said. "I'll wait. I promise." And he meant it. He left with her ring tied around his neck on a leather cord. But winter came with no return. There was a war on the border. Cousin died. The estate was a mess of debt and missing ledgers. His father, once proud and sharp-tongued, grew frail. Edric spent weeks in court, months on horseback. 1 year became 2. He wrote her, first often, then less. The letters took too long to arrive or went unanswered. Finally, one spring, a note reached him on the back of a merchant's invoice. "She has gone, married into a house of northern blood. A match arranged swiftly, with regret." That was all. No farewell, no explanation, just gone. He rode north once, during a frost-thin autumn, trying to find the manor listed in the message. But by the time he reached it, the family had moved. No one knew where. The maid who answered the door had never heard of a woman named Mara. He returned to Linmere in silence. He wore black for a year, though no one had died. And he built a garden behind the house. It wasn't grand. No roses. No hedges shaped like beasts. Just herbs. Violets. Bluebells. The flowers she'd loved. He never married. Suitors were sent. Letters came. Noble daughters arrived with painted smiles and memorized lines. He bowed. He poured wine. He answered politely, but the part of him that might have loved again was buried under that garden, in soil touched only by his hands. The years passed. He grew into his title. He was respected, even liked, but no one saw him smile, except once. A visiting minstrel sang a song in a language not often heard in those halls, a tune that curled at the edges like smoke. Edric rose from his seat, walked to the window, and stayed there until the last note faded. The next morning, he asked the steward to find the minstrel again, not to punish, but to ask the name of the song. "It's called Waiting Beneath the Jasmine Tree," the minstrel said. "From the coast. The tongue is old." Edric nodded. "I knew someone who sang it. That was all." At dusk, he walked to the garden and sat among the violets. The wind carried no song, but he hummed a fragment of the tune, quietly, eyes half closed. A servant boy, watching from the shadows, would later say the Viscount had tears in his eyes. No one believed him, but then again, no one ever really asked. They had shared everything once. A bed, a bowl, a ribbon passed between them like a treasure. From childhood to first blood, from scraped knees to whispered secrets, they had been side by side. Her name was Lienne. The other girl was Marta, both daughters of maids, both born beneath the sloped beams of the castle's east wing, where sunlight only reached at mid-morning and the walls smelled faintly of salt and iron. Their mothers worked in the linen halls, their fathers long gone or never named. They ran errands together, learned to bow at the same time, were cuffed by the same kitchen master for stealing berries. When they were caught giggling in the great hall after dark, the steward threatened to send them to the scullery. They held hands in silence. He didn't. As girls, they played at being noblewomen, wrapping themselves in tablecloths, holding spoons like scepters. "We'll marry knights," Marta once declared. Lienne shook her head. "I'll never marry." "Then what?" "I'll be your lady's maid," she said. "When you're a real lady, in a castle made of moonlight." Marta smiled. "Promise, promise." And for years it stayed that way, even as they grew older, and the boys in the kitchens began to notice them, and the older maids whispered behind aprons. They still braided each other's hair, still talked of futures whispered in candlelight. Then came the Countess, a new mistress for the castle, sharp-eyed, fox-faced, with a voice that could silence a room. She brought her own ladies, but found them lacking in wit. One afternoon, she wandered into the sewing hall and saw Marta threading silver into a hem with a singer's grace. "What's your name, girl?" "Marta." "And do you speak clearly?" "Yes, my lady." "And read?" "Enough." The Countess tilted her head. "You'll do." That night, Marta didn't sleep in their corner of the servants' dormitory. She didn't come to fetch water with Lien in the morning. Didn't slip her a sweet under the table at noon. She appeared at supper dressed in fine wool, hair pinned high. Lien blinked. Marta avoided her eyes. It happened like a dream turning sharp at the edges. The next week, Marta was wearing gloves. A month later, she had her own chamber. 2 months after that, she stood beside the Countess at court, handing her perfumed scarves and laughing at Lord's jokes. She didn't look back. Lien tried to speak to her once, in the hallway near the armory, just as Marta stepped out of the Countess's solar. "Marta!" Her voice cracked. Marta paused. Her face flickered, something soft beneath the powder and pride. "Lien," she said, "I miss you." A beat passed. Then Marta straightened. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because they don't matter anymore." Lien flinched. Marta's lips parted, as if to take the words back. But she didn't. She turned and walked away. Lien stood there a long time. The next week, she asked to be transferred to the kitchens. Away from sewing, from gossip, from the scent of roses in the ladies' wing. She scrubbed pans until her hands cracked, peeled roots until her back ached. She stopped speaking except when spoken to. But at night, she would sit on the floor of the pantry, clutching an old ribbon. The one they used to pass between them like treasure. It still smelled faintly of time. Years passed. Marta rose. She caught the eye of a widowed baron, became Lady Marta of Fenrook, wore jewels, learned falconry, visited court. She sent no letters, but Lien saw her name in the mouths of merchants, heard songs sung about her beauty, saw her painted on a prayer card once, kneeling before a saint with a face too serene. And then, one summer, the baron died. Marta returned to the castle where they had both been born, richer, dressed in black silk, with a lady's maid of her own. She did not walk the servants' wing. But one night, Lien came upon her in the garden. The moon was thin. The lilies drooped with dew. Marta stood alone, her veil drawn back, staring at the old fountain. Lien meant to turn away, but a voice said, "Do you still hate me?" She stopped. "I never did," Lien said. Marta turned. Her face was pale, bare of paint, older. "I never forgot you," she whispered. "You left." "I had to." "No, you chose to." They stood in silence. The fountain gurgled behind them. "I thought," Marta said slowly, "if I rose high enough I'd be safe, that I could choose who I became. But I was always just what someone else needed." "You were mine once," Lien said, voice trembling. "And you were my heart," Marta whispered. "But you gave it away." Marta stepped forward, took Lien's hand. "I'm sorry." Lien looked down. "I still dream of you," she said. "Then let me stay this time." They didn't embrace. Not that night. But Marta sent her maid away, and Lien returned to sewing. And sometimes, in the quiet hours, when the sun had not yet risen, 2 women sat by the fire, threading needles in silence, remembering what they had once shared and what had almost been lost. He arrived with the spring winds, his boots scuffed, his smile too wide for a man with no coin, a lute strapped to his back, a feather tucked behind one ear, and a voice like velvet soaked in wine. No one knew his name, not truly, though he gave many: Nico, Alan, Tomas, each one changing with the town or the mood. But when he sang only of one woman. Her name he never revealed, but those who listened closely would hear it, half buried in rhyme. A soft name, one that curled at the edges like smoke. He sang her into every hall, every tavern, every square. And he sang as if remembering her was the only thing keeping his heart from unraveling. At first they thought it was fantasy. Troubadours always wrote of impossible love. Queens, priestesses, angels glimpsed in dreams. But the way he sang, gentle, trembling, as if the notes themselves ached. It felt real, too real. He stayed a week in the village of Breakups, performed nightly in the taproom of the Wren's Hollow, drinking more mead than was wise, trading songs for supper. But on the 7th night the wrong ears listened. The Reeves steward, half drunk and half jealous, recognized the name woven in the lyrics. Not fantasy, not fiction. Lady Cyril, wife of Lord then Nick, keeper of 3 keeps, and known for her cold beauty and sharper mind. The minstrel had not imagined her. He had known her, worse, loved her, and sung about her openly. The steward reported it. The message carried by horse, and within 2 days a reply returned. The minstrel was to be detained. He heard of it before they reached him, and vanished. No one saw him leave. Just his lute, left behind on a windowsill, and a note tucked under its strings. I only ever meant to remember her. Rumors scattered like dandelion seed. Some said he was captured and flayed. Others that he fled over the border, took another name and sang no more. A few whispered he had drowned himself in the river, with her name on his lips. But they were wrong. He resurfaced in the southern woodlands, singing still, softer now, cautious, but the songs remained, and so did she. One innkeeper remembered him asking, "Do you think love is safer when you never speak it aloud?" The innkeeper, half asleep, only shrugged. He smiled. "I thought so once. I was wrong." He stayed one night, wrote a new song in the margins of a bread ledger, left it behind when he departed. The lyrics were simple. She walked with the grace of candlelight, and left behind a man half-shadowed. Years passed. The songs spread, altered, rewritten. Others claimed them. Lords hired bards to perform them at feasts. The lady's name disappeared, replaced by metaphors: silver flame, cold dawn, the still river. But to those who had heard him first, the notes still carried her. One day, in a crowded market far from his birthplace, he saw her. Older, robed in gray, a veil drawn low. She passed without looking, but her hand brushed the corner of a harp string as she walked by, and he swore he felt the world still. That night he did not perform. He sat by the fire in a borrowed cloak and stared into the coals. "I saw her," he whispered, though no one was near. "She still walks." He never sang her name again, but the songs kept growing. Once, at a royal wedding, the queen herself requested one of his verses. She did not know its origin, only that it made her chest ache. And somewhere, in a stone manor half swallowed by moss, Lady Cyril heard the same tune drifting through an open window. She turned her face to the wind and closed her eyes, not smiling, but not crying either, because even silence in the right shape can be an answer. The cottage stood alone at the edge of Fern Hollow, where the wind curved low and the mist clung to the ground like a secret. It had been hers for 5 years now, ceded to her in parchment and ink after the man who owned it died and the priest blessed the threshold with oil and dust. Her name was Anais. The villagers called her the widow, though they rarely said her name, not out of cruelty, simply habit. She had always been someone's. First her father's daughter, then her husband's wife. Now nobody's, and they didn't quite know what to make of that. Her husband, Sir Edouard, had not been unkind. He hadn't beaten her, nor shouted, nor brought home other women. He'd simply been indifferent. like a knight in a tapestry, hands clasped in prayer, eyes always somewhere far beyond her. She had married him at 19. Her father had arranged it to ease a debt with the crown. Edouard was older, with a white-streaked beard and a voice that never rose above a hush. She remembered her wedding day as a blur of wool and incense. He'd touched her hand once, not again for weeks. Their home had been a stone manor north of the river, where deer walked through the courtyard and the shutters creaked in winter. She had kept the books, sorted the candles, laid out his robes for feast days. He had spent most of his time in prayer or in the solar with his steward. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly, just unseen, as if she had been folded neatly into a drawer and only taken out when someone needed her. She had no children, whether by fortune or design, she never knew. Edouard never asked. When he fell ill, quietly, slowly, she sat by his bed and read to him. Psalms, sermons, one day a poem. He looked at her then, really looked. "You always had a beautiful voice," he said. It was the last thing he told her. After the funeral, the manor passed to his nephew, who offered her a cottage by Fern Hollow and a purse of silver. "You were kind to him," he said. "That's worth something." She took it, and so, at 31, Anais began her life again. The first year was strange. The cottage was too quiet, the bed too large. She arranged the garden with trembling fingers, unsure how deep to plant the leeks. But slowly, she found a rhythm. She woke with the sun, fed the hens, lit a fire even when she didn't need it. And most evenings, she walked to the edge of the hollow, where the wind ran in soft sighs through the reeds. There was no one to serve, no one to answer to, no one to shape herself around. She began to hum, then to sing, and then to speak aloud, at first in questions. What shall I plant next week? Do I need more salt? Is it already May? Then, in time, she began speaking not to herself, but to the woman she might have been. The one who never married, who had stayed in her father's bookshop and copied letters for coin, who might have traveled to the southern port and tasted foreign wine, who might have learned to paint or dance or kiss someone who looked her in the eyes. She did not hate the life she'd lived, but she grieved it, as one grieves a lost twin. The villagers found her strange, but not dangerous. They brought her eggs, asked for balm when they had headaches, trusted her when their babies wouldn't sleep. She never remarried. Once, a traveling merchant stayed a week too long, leaving her a carved comb and a long look that lingered at the doorstep. She returned the comb and closed the door, not out of anger, but because she had only just learned how to be alone. And it was sacred. One winter, a young girl named Morel came knocking, barefoot in the frost, shivering and breathless. "My mother is ill," she said. Anais followed her without question, brought herbs, cloths, her own blanket, sat by the sickbed 3 nights. On the 4th, the mother whispered, "They say you were a wife." Anais nodded. "Did he break your heart?" "No," Anais said softly. "He never held it long enough to drop." After that, Morel visited often, first for advice, then just for warmth. They sat together by the hearth, Morel asking questions, Anais weaving memories into stories, true or almost true. And one day, Morel asked, "Would you do it again?" Anais stared into the flame. "No," she said, "but I don't regret that I did." And that was the difference between sorrow and bitterness. That was the wisdom of Fern Hollow. They said she was cold, but no one who had ever stood in her presence believed that. Queen Allay of Merrowvale had a voice like honey on stone, soft, deliberate, impossible to interrupt. She wore no jewels save for a single jet ring, and when she entered a room, candles seemed to still themselves. She had been married at 15, crowned at 16, queen at 17. The king, Mathan, was 15 years her senior, broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, a man more comfortable in war camps than courtrooms. Their wedding was the result of treaties and tired hands pressed together under Latin prayers. There was no love in it, only ink and expectation. For years they played their roles. He rode to war. She ruled the realm. While he chased borders and ballads, she managed the grain, the roads, the coin, the plague when it came, the scribes when they lied, the nobles when they whispered. She did not weep when he left, and did not smile when he returned. At feasts, they sat side by side, but rarely spoke. Yet the court learned quickly, if you wanted something done, you went to the queen. If you wanted something delayed, you went to the king. Ale bore him 2 children. One died in infancy. The other, a daughter named Estelle, was raised beside her mother's throne, taught to read laws before she was taught to curtsy. By the time Ale was 30, she had ruled longer than most kings. And she had done it without love, without scandal, without ever once raising her voice. But even stone wears thin. It began with whispers, of mistresses brought back from the front, of gold disappearing from the war coffers, of captains more loyal to Mathen than the crown. She did not confront him, not immediately. Instead, she waited, listened, watched. One night, in the queen's solar, lined with books and warmed with cedarwood fire, she summoned the chancellor. "Tell me what you know," she said. He hesitated. "Your Majesty, it is not treason to be beloved by the soldiers." "But it is treason," she replied calmly, "to take coin from foreign hands while wearing my ring." He said nothing after that. The next morning, the king returned from campaign, mud still on his boots. She met him not in the hall, but in the old chapel where they had first been crowned. He laughed when he saw her. "You look like judgment," he said. "I am," she replied. He frowned. "You're angry about the coin." "No," she said. "I'm angry that you forgot I was queen." He stepped forward. "You have no cause to raise arms." "I need no arms," she said. "Only words." She handed him a scroll. It was not a charge of treason. It was an annulment. He stared at it. "You can't," he muttered. "I can," she said. "And I have. You have no heir. I have Estelle. She's a girl. She is mine." He did not shout. He did not beg. But he looked at her, truly looked, for the first time in years. "You never loved me," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not even a little? I respected you, and I carried you further than you deserved." He left the next morning. No parade, no banners, just a single horse and silence. The court was stunned. A queen dismissing her king was unheard of. But Ale did not falter. She ruled alone, wrote new laws, forged new alliances, raised her daughter to speak 6 languages and fear no man. Years passed, and sometimes at dusk, she would walk the chapel corridor, fingertips brushing the old stones, not in mourning, but in memory, not of what was lost, but what she had reclaimed. Her name, her rule, her life, and those who called her cold, they never saw the way she cupped her daughter's cheek before battle plans. They never heard the lullabies she sang in a forgotten tongue. They never knew that when she spoke the king's name in prayer, it was not with hatred, but with clarity, because not all heartbreak is thunder. Some comes quietly, like a scroll unrolled, and a crown placed back on its rightful head. The abbey stood at the edge of the cliff, where the wind carved songs into the stone. From its bell tower, you could see the sea, gray and endless, churning like a heart that never found rest. Inside its walls, the rule of St. Aldrich held sway. No meat, no idle laughter, and silence except during prayer. Brother Theo had come to the abbey at 19, after his mother died, and left him no inheritance but a well-worn psalter and a quiet disposition. He had been faithful from the first day, rose with the bells, scrubbed floors until they gleamed, fasted without complaint, memorized scripture until the Latin sang on his tongue like birdsong. He loved the silence, until Brother Matthew arrived. Matthew was older by 4 years. sent from another monastery for reasons no one explained, only hinted. He moved like water, not timid, but smooth, graceful in his stillness. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was gentle, careful, as if every word cost him something. Theo noticed him in the scriptorium, noticed how his fingers handled vellum as if it were glass, how his lips moved slightly when he read, as though tasting every syllable. They were assigned to copy the same text, De Consolation Philosophiae, the work of a Roman long dead, about loss, reason, and the strange comfort of knowing the world spins regardless of sorrow. At first they worked in silence, then a glance, a brush of hands while passing quills, a shared moment of laughter when a scribe's inkpot tipped and stained a page with a perfect black moon. They did not speak of affection, but in the stillness between psalms, their hearts bent toward each other. It began with walking together after Compline, when the stars hung low and the rules permitted only gestures. A smile, a tilt of the head, fingers nearly touching in the folds of their robes. One evening, Theo slipped a folded scrap into Matthew's palm as they crossed the garden path. It read, "You make the silence feel full." Matthew said nothing, but the next day he left a dried violet tucked into Theo's psalter. And after that something opened, a new kind of devotion. They never broke their vows, not with hands, not with breath, but in the space between vows they built something sacred. In glances, in poems scratched on the backs of unused pages, in the way Matthew began to copy texts more slowly, just to sit beside Theo longer. But the abbey notices things, even when it does not speak. The prior called Theo to the chapel one evening, asked him gently, "Is your heart fully here?" And Theo, after a long pause, said, "Yes, because it was, just not in the way they wanted." After that, the rules tightened. Theo was reassigned to the garden, Matthew to the infirmary. They passed only in corridors, could not speak, could not even share mass side by side. One winter night, Theo returned to his cell and found a slip of parchment under his pillow. "If this must be penance, then let me carry it for both of us." No name, no signature, but he knew. The next day Matthew was gone, sent to a monastery across the sea. A transfer, they said. No warning, no farewell, just gone. Theo stood at the edge of the cliff for hours that evening, staring into the sea. He did not cry. He fasted for 3 days, then returned to his duties. The seasons changed. Years passed. He became a teacher of novices, a gentle guide, a soft voice in the echoing halls. But he never forgot, never stopped looking at the sea. Each year, on the feast of St. Aldrich, he walked alone to the bell tower and read from De Consolation. He had long since memorized it, but still he read, aloud, as if someone were listening. And once, on a spring morning decades later, a letter arrived, sent from across the sea. No seal, just 3 words in a hand he still knew. "You made silence sing." Theo held it to his chest and whispered his reply into the wind. Her name was Ellen, though few remembered it. To the village she was simply Tom's wife, the woman with soot-streaked sleeves who brought lunch to the forge at midday and scrubbed ash from the laundry stone each evening until her hands were red. Tom was not cruel, but he was loud and proud and always tired. He loved his forge more than he loved silence, and the clang of iron on iron became the rhythm of their days. They married young. She was 17, he 21. He inherited the forge from his uncle. She inherited his hunger and his heat. First she thought that was love. He called her Duck and my girl, and kissed her hair when he passed behind her in the doorway. But he never asked what she dreamed of, or if she had ever been to the other side of the river, or if she liked the smell of fire. He asked what was for supper. He asked for clean shirts. He asked if the rent had been paid. But he never asked her name. Not truly. They had 3 children in 5 years. 2 boys, 1 girl. She fed them, clothed them, taught them to tie knots and wipe their mouths. When Tom drank too much, he shouted. Not at her, not quite, but loud enough that the walls flinched. When he broke a stool in anger one night, she swept up the splinters before the children could ask what happened. One morning, when her daughter was 7, the girl asked, Mama, what's your real name? Ellen blinked, and then answered, as if reading from a book she'd once loved and lost. Ellen. The child repeated it, quietly, as if tasting a secret. That evening, Ellen wrote it down, on the back of an old invoice, in ink that trembled at first. She tucked it into the folds of her apron and carried it for days, just to remember. She began waking earlier, before the rooster crowed, before the children stirred. In that dark blue hour, she sat by the window with a candle and wrote her name again and again on scraps of old parchment. Ellen, 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 as if saying it enough could open a door somewhere. One day she didn't go to the forge. Instead, she walked down the road to the far meadow, where the old woman lived in a crooked cottage ringed by lavender. They called her the spinner, said she could weave protection into thread, truth into ribbons. Said her husband had died of fever, but she never took another. She lived alone and smiled only when she meant it. Ellen asked her for thread. Not for mending, she said, for remembering. The spinner nodded once and gave her a skein of deep red wool, soft and strong. Back home, Ellen wove it through the cuffs of her shift. Not for fashion, for herself. Tom didn't notice, but the children did. Mama's wearing colors now, her son whispered to his sister. Ellen smiled to herself. At the market, she traded carrots for paper. At the bakehouse, she gave a pie in exchange for ink. And slowly, over weeks, she began to write. Not letters, not records, but herself. Small stories, fragments, a memory of her mother's singing voice. A recipe for soup she had made only once but never forgotten. A dream she'd had when she was 10, of living in a tower with books for walls. She hid them under the hearthstone, not because they were forbidden, but because they were hers, and hers alone. One night, Tom returned from the tavern red-faced and roaring with laughter. He dropped his tools on the table, sat too heavily in the chair she had mended. He glanced at her shift. What's this then? He asked. Trying to look fine for the baker? She said nothing. His laughter fell silent, and for the first time he looked at her. Not just past her, not through her, but at her, and she was not afraid. You look different, he said. I remembered who I am, she replied. He blinked, and for once he had no answer. She didn't leave him, but she stopped shrinking. She stopped hurrying to soften his moods. She stopped asking before spending her own coin. She began to walk to the river on Sundays alone. And once, she spent an entire afternoon in the meadow picking lavender and writing a song she would never sing aloud. The children noticed. Her daughter called her Ellen, shyly, once, and she smiled. Yes, she said, that's me. Years later, when the forge passed to her eldest, and the house quieted, and Tom grew slower in speech and body, she sat beside the fire and opened the old ledger she kept hidden. It was filled now, cover to cover, with her name, Ellen, and all the lives she might have lived, all the ones she still could. The letter came folded into a parcel of herbs, mint, thyme, and a pinch of dried rose petals. The script was small and careful, the parchment brittle at the corners, as if it had waited too long to be written. It began simply, Do you still think of me when it rains? He read it 3 times before sitting down. The hearth in his study had gone cold, but he didn't stir the coals. Instead, he placed the letter on the table beside him and looked out the window, where the clouds hung low, pressing against the hills like a sigh waiting to be released. He hadn't heard from her in 37 years, not since the last feast of St. Marine, when they had stood behind the chapel and agreed to part. Not with cruelty, not with regret, but with the softness of those who know that love, sometimes, is not enough. Her name was Avis. He had met her when he was a clerk's apprentice and she was the steward's niece, visiting for the harvest. She had red ribbons in her hair and a laugh that made the sparrows pause mid-flight. He'd helped her carry barley sacks. She taught him a prayer in her native tongue, though neither of them had known what it meant. They'd kissed once, beneath the bell tower, where the ivy grew thickest, twice when the rain came suddenly and they ran for cover beneath the oak. And a third time, quiet, slow, almost prayerful, the night before she left. They wrote for a while. She sent pressed flowers in hers. He enclosed small poems, written on the backs of tithe ledgers. But life thickened. He was promoted. She was betrothed. He served a baron who cared for nothing but land and coin. She married a man who preferred horses to conversation. They did what they were told, what was expected. The letters stopped. Years passed. He became a tutor, then a scribe, then finally the seneschal of a quiet, windswept hold. She vanished from gossip. Only once did he hear her name. In a merchant's tale, passed down from another town, the Lady of Redvale? Quiet, keeps to herself. Lost a son, I think. And now, all these years later, a letter. Not bitter, not longing, just present. He read the rest slowly. I have a garden now. The roses bloom late like you always said they would. I still hum that silly rhyme you taught me about the weather. The one that made no sense. I married as you did not. I bore children as you did not. But I wonder sometimes, in the early hours when even the bees sleep, who would I have been if I'd stayed by the oak tree a little longer? He folded the letter, did not cry, but let the silence settle around him like snow. That evening he wrote her back. I never learned to grow roses, but the sparrows still visit. And yes, it still rains the way it did that summer, soft and sudden. And yes, Avis, I still think of you. He sealed the parchment, did not include his name. She would know. Weeks passed. No reply came, but the next parcel brought lavender. No note, just lavender. And that was enough, because some breakups are not thunder, not slamming doors or final screams. Some are soft, long, like fire cooling into ash, still warm, still glowing, long after the smoke has cleared. Each morning, Tom placed a heel of bread on the windowsill. It wasn't much. A crust, a bite softened with honey, sometimes a half apple, if the orchard had been generous. He never said why, and when the village children asked, he only smiled and said, "It's for her in case she comes back hungry." He lived alone in a thatched cottage near the woods, where the trees leaned close and the air always smelled faintly of moss and ash. He was neither young nor old, just worn in the way that shoes get after miles walked in silence. Once, long ago, he had been engaged. Her name was Bet, not Elizabeth, not Bettina, just Bet. She was a weaver's daughter, quick-fingered and quicker-tongued. She could pluck burrs from wool without breaking the thread and sing while doing it. Her hair smelled of lavender and smoke. They met in a hayfield during harvest. He offered her a drink. She offered him a laugh. They were inseparable after that. He carved her a comb from cherrywood. She stitched his name into a kerchief and tucked it into his sleeve the day he left for the city to learn a trade. "I'll be gone 1 season," he promised. 2, she corrected, grinning. "You're hopeless with maps." But she kissed him anyway. They wrote, first often, then less so, as the work thickened and the hours blurred. But each letter ended the same. "Come back to me. I will." And he did. Returned with calloused hands and a tool belt full of skills. He arrived just after dawn, the sun catching on dew and rooftops, walking the last mile with a foolish grin. But her door was open, and her bed was empty. They said she had vanished. No warning, no note, no struggle, just gone. Her father said she had gone for water and never returned. The well was still full, the bucket untouched. The village searched. For days, then weeks. Some whispered bandits. Others murmured darker things. Fey folk, spirits, a curse from the old forest. Tom searched longer than all of them. He walked until his boots fell apart, asked every traveler, sang the old rhymes she used to hum, hoping something or someone might answer, but no one ever did. He returned home months later with hollow cheeks and a gaze like fog. He built a bench beneath her window, and every morning he left a crust of bread, in case she was cold, or thin, or waiting for a sign that she was still remembered. Years passed, children grew, new lovers married, but Tom never did. Why not? The blacksmith asked once over mugs of cider. I'm already promised, Tom said. The smith didn't laugh, because he saw the way Tom looked toward the woods each dusk, as if hoping the leaves might whisper her name back. Once a year, on the day she vanished, Tom wove a garland of thistle and oat and hung it on the gate, a hedge which once told him those were protection charms. He didn't know if he believed in charms, but he believed in remembering. Then one morning, after nearly 40 years, he woke late. Too late, the sun already high, the bread still in the cupboard. He cursed softly and hurried to the windowsill, but someone had already been there. The sill was dusted with crumbs, and a small scrap of cloth lay in their place. Frayed, lavender-stitched, it bore a single word. Still, he stood there a long time, eyes closed, heart thudding like distant hoofbeats. He didn't know what it meant. If it meant she was still alive, or still waiting, or still his. He didn't need to know. He just needed to believe that some love doesn't end. It waits, like bread on a windowsill. They found them in the rafters after she died, folded into an old grain sack, tied with frayed string, the parchment yellowed and soft as petals. 32 letters, each one addressed with the same name in the same careful script. Renaud. No one in the village remembered him. The priest, who had come to bless the room, opened the first with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps a ledger or a list. But it was a love letter, simple, quiet, written in the voice of someone who still had hope. Today, I passed the baker's window and thought of how you always picked the crooked loaves. Said they had more heart. It made me smile. That smile felt like you. The name on the envelope was Edli. She had lived alone in the cottage for nearly 40 years, taught herbs to the midwives, made barley porridge for the sick, and kept bees behind the hedge. People liked her. Children brought her feathers and questions. Women came for advice, but she never spoke of love. When asked, she simply said, "That story belongs to someone else now." No one pressed her. But it was in those letters, carefully dated month after month, that her story lived. Some were full of light, others of sorrow. I heard you've taken a post with the Duke's men. Is the pay fair? Are the boots kind to your feet? I pray they are. I saw your sister in the square. She didn't recognize me, or pretended not to. That hurt more than it should. I've started talking to the bees. I think they understand what it means to miss someone. The last was dated 23 years ago. This will be the last, I think. Not because I've stopped loving you, but because I need to learn how to love the days again. Even without you in them, there was no bitterness, no plea to return, just the steady voice of someone learning to hold grief like a shawl. Something that warms you even as it reminds you what's been lost. The priest placed the letters back into their pouch and told no one. He buried them with her, because some words are not meant for archives. They're meant for the wind, the bees, the silence between prayers, and for those who wait, not to be answered but simply to say, "I was here. I remembered. I loved you even when you forgot to write back." The headstone read Brother Jareth of Elmside. It was clean, modest, carved in the old style, just a name, a date, and the mark of the Holy Order, a carved star encircled by vines. The grave sat on the far end of the monastery cemetery, half swallowed by ivy, beside two unmarked mounds and a crumbling wall. Every week, without fail, a woman came to sit beside it. No one knew her name. She wore simple wool, deep blue and gray, with a white veil tucked under her chin and hands always clasped like she was still listening for an answer. The monks let her be. They thought she was just a pious widow, mourning a relative. But old Brother Emmerich, the last one alive who had lived through the war, knew better. The man buried there wasn't a monk. He had never been one. His name was Oral, and he had died for a love that could never be named in public, only in whisper and memory. The year had been bloody, a border war no one remembered the reason for. Just another line on a map, a crown that felt too light, a lord's son with too much pride. Oral was a soldier, one of the good ones, quick with a joke, but quicker with his sword. And when he met her, he was already promised to someone else. She was a noble's daughter, not wealthy, but titled enough to be valuable. Their love began in glances across the courtyard, the kind that catch in the ribs. She brought him water after drills. He once wrapped her injured hand when she cut it on a spindle. That was all it took. 2 moments, a lifetime curled in between. They met in shadow, always careful, in a ruined orchard behind the chapel, under starlight where no one asked questions. And they loved without saying the word, because even speaking it made it real. And if it was real, it could be broken. The war ended suddenly. Oral was wounded, not fatally, but enough to be discharged. She begged her father to let her marry him. Her father laughed. He arranged her to wed a baron's nephew instead. Oral never showed up to say goodbye. The day before her wedding, she rode to the orchard alone, and found the tree they had kissed beneath already gone, struck by lightning the week before. She wept for that more than for the wedding. She married, lived in the north, bore no children, wrote no poems, until one summer many years later, she heard a rumor from a passing merchant about a battlefield burial gone wrong, that a soldier, gravely wounded but not yet dead, had been mistaken for a dead monk in the chaos and interred at the monastery near Elmside. She rode there alone, and found a grave with a name she did not know but a date that matched. The monks did not remember, but she knew. She knelt by the stone, placed her hand upon it, and said aloud the only thing she could, "I'm sorry," and she kept returning, year after year, season after season, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with nothing but silence. No one ever joined her. No one ever challenged her. Only once did Brother Emmerich, nearly blind by then, sit beside her and ask, "Was he yours?" And she replied, "No, but I was his." After that, he never asked again. Some bonds were never consecrated by church or scroll. Some names were never written in records. But the heart remembers what the world forgets. And sometimes, the greatest tragedy is not that love ends, but that it is buried under the wrong name. Her name was Merit. She lived in a house with no chimney, just a smoke hole that let out the worst of it and let in the rest. The walls were daubed with clay and straw, patched every year when the rains came too early. She rose before dawn, when the cock still dozed and the thatch dripped with night. Her life was the same each day. Grind the grain, milk the goats, boil the mash, turn the compost, check the roof. She wasn't unhappy. She had 3 sons and a husband who didn't drink much and who patched his own boots without being asked. She sang when she worked, quietly, half under her breath. Songs she couldn't remember learning. Songs she thought maybe her mother once sang, or perhaps just the wind. And one day, while peeling root vegetables with her neighbor, Elsie, the talk turned to foolish things. First kisses, old flings, the boys from summer fairs who could spin a girl once and make her feel like fire. Elsie said, "Do you remember your first?" Merritt blinked, and then frowned. She tried. She knew there had been someone. A boy with a scar on his brow and a laugh like stones skipping water. Or was it a boy with red hair who smelled of mint? She thought they'd met at the village fire once, when she was maybe 13, no, 14? Or 15. Was there music? She could remember the feeling, the rush in her chest, the way the air felt sharper around him, like everything had suddenly mattered more. But his name? Gone. She couldn't summon it. She laughed it off. Must not have been very good, if I can't recall the name. Else I cackled. Or too good, and your mind's protecting you. But that night, long after the children slept and her husband's snores rose from the hearthbed, Merritt stared at the ceiling. She tried again. What color were his eyes? Did he ever hold her hand? Was there a kiss? There must have been a kiss. But she couldn't remember. All she could recall was a moment in a field of barley when the sun caught something gold, and a voice that had called her name like it meant something. The next day, she walked to the edge of the old orchard, where the last wild plums grew and the stones of the ruined wall lay like bones. She stood there a long time, not waiting, not searching, just standing, as if something inside her was still listening for footsteps. But none came. She gathered a sprig of meadowsweet from the fence line, carried it home, tucked it behind the wooden spoon rack without knowing why. And for days afterward, every time she passed it, her heart beat strangely, as if mourning something it couldn't name. That spring, she began to write things down. Just little things. The name of the goat who always nipped. The rhyme her son made up about mud. The smell of the barley soup when the wind came from the east. Not for posterity, just to keep them from vanishing. And one evening, years later, when she was gray and her hands bent with age, she looked at the list and whispered to herself, I loved someone once. I don't remember who, but I know I did. And somehow that was enough, because forgetting is not the same as losing. And sometimes, the heart keeps singing even when the name fades from the page. It begins always in the silence after someone leaves. Not the kind of silence that comes from shouting or storms. No, the quiet that follows a closing door. A final glance. A word half-spoken and never finished. A meal set for two and cleared for one. This is where most love stories truly end. Not at the altar, not at the burial, but in the hours and days that trickle like slow candle wax, when everything normal becomes strange again. We don't remember every parting, not in full, but we remember the feeling, the lump in the throat that wouldn't swallow, the sunlight that hit the chair they used to sit in, the way the room smelled when they were gone. Not of perfume or sweat or firewood, but of absence itself. And in the medieval world, those endings multiplied like echoes in the cold. No one had time to grieve the way we imagine now. There were no therapists, no novels to explain the shape of longing, no journals unless you were rich or rare. The fields had to be sown, the goats milked, the fires kept lit, whether your heart was broken or not. And so the people folded their sorrow into habits. They sang while they worked, spoke little, walked longer, stirred soup slower. Some cried when the house was empty. Some never cried at all. But heartbreak was everywhere. You just had to know where to look. In the girl who braided her own hair every morning and whispered someone else's name while she tied the ribbon. In the boy who went silent every time the spring fair came around, because she had left during the last one and never said goodbye. In the old man who sharpened tools in the yard while humming a tune his wife had once hummed, and hadn't in 20 years. Love did not end with a flourish back then. Faded, slowly, quietly, until it was a memory sewn into a hymn, a name carved on a tree, a necklace worn under the blouse, close to the skin but never shown. And yet, despite all this breaking, all this parting, people kept loving. Because what else was there? The body still ached to hold. The soul still reached, even if all it had to hold was a dream or a ghost or the idea of what might have been. A merchant in Bruges once wrote in the margin of his inventory ledger, I miss her less when I walk fast. It wasn't poetry, but it was true, because movement numbs memory, and the medieval world moved fast, even when it looked slow from the outside. The carts creaked, the bells rang, the geese honked, and the grain had to be hauled. But inside the chest, behind the ribs, something stayed quiet, waiting, not to be healed, but simply to be remembered. They said the river was shallow in summer, but wide enough to divide two kingdoms. On one side, the land of her birth, green, damp, full of larks and honeybees. On the other, the realm of her marriage, dusty fields, tall spears, and silence thicker than the forests that lined the frontier. Her name was Lady Isabel. She was wed at 17 to a lord twice her age, as part of a peace pact forged after 15 years of border skirmishes. The ink was barely dry on the treaty when they placed the ring on her finger. No love, no courtesies, only duty. She rode across the river with a bridal train of 12 and returned with none. New name, new crest, new life, but what she remembered most was the boy she left behind. Not a suitor, not quite, just Alric, the beekeeper's son. He had helped her climb the stone fence once when she was 10 and tore her gown. He mended it with sap and thread and didn't tell. By 13, they'd shared books and stolen apples and promises too large for their hands. He never kissed her, not even the day she left, just placed a ribbon, green as early moss, into her palm and whispered, "Don't become someone else." She tried not to, but the castle across the river was made for forgetting. Its halls were too high, its windows too narrow. Her husband had a sword in every corner and a frown that never lifted. She gave him no children. He gave her no words. She walked alone in the gardens, wrote letters she never sent, one each year on the day of her departure. Are the bees still hived behind the chapel? Do the willows still weep in the field by the gate? Do you still remember the ribbon? She kept them in a box beneath her bed, wrapped in the same cloth that had once held honey cakes. The years unspooled like thread from a spindle. Her hair grayed. The wars returned. And one winter, while the snow was still clean, word came that the village where she had been born had burned. A raid, a retaliation, or just the wind catching the thatch. She asked no questions. She only went to the river, alone, wrapped in wool, her hands bare despite the frost. And there she stood, not looking across but down, into the black water that carried both sides, both names, both lives. And she wept, not for Alric, but for the girl who had once believed a ribbon could hold back the tide. That night she took out the letters, read them all aloud, then one by one placed them into the fire. The flames did not crackle, they whispered, and as the last turned to ash, she placed her palm over her heart and said only, "I didn't forget." And in some way that was a kind of keeping, a kind of love that crossed the river after all. Some say the worst part of heartbreak is the loneliness. But in the medieval world, loneliness was already part of life. You could be surrounded by people, family, servants, farmhands, villagers, and still be alone with your thoughts. You might sleep beside a husband who never touched you gently, raise children with someone who barely looked at you, pray in a chapel while a dozen others prayed beside you, and still feel like no one heard your silence. So perhaps the worst part wasn't loneliness. Perhaps it was invisibility, the kind of invisibility that came when the love you felt didn't match the life you lived. When your days were full of tasks, but your nights were full of ghosts. When the person you wanted wasn't the one beside you at table, but the one who had long ago moved on, or disappeared, or married someone else, or gone off to war and never returned. We think of medieval life as rigid, fixed, dictated by church and crown and birth. And it was. But the heart has never cared for rules. Even a milkmaid with no coin, even a monk under vows, even a baker too busy to speak. Each of them could love with a force that bent time itself. It might only last a summer, or a single night beneath the trees, or a walk to the well when the moon was full. But that love was real, and when it ended, the pain was real too. Some women poured that pain into prayer. They lit candles not just for souls, but for secrets, for names they would never say aloud, but carried like relics pressed beneath their tongue. Some men wrote no poems, but chopped wood until their arms went numb, bled themselves on brambles because they wouldn't bleed from tears, took up service in distant towns just to avoid the scent of a certain street in spring. They did not call it heartbreak. They called it life, but that didn't make it any less sharp, or soft, or sacred. Sometimes it left marks you could see. The old scar where the ring had rubbed the skin too long. The pew carved with initials now faded by decades of touch. The edge of a recipe kept folded in a chest, made only once a year, in memory of the woman who first made it. And sometimes it left no mark at all. Just a pause, a sigh, a single moment while hanging laundry, when the breeze lifts your hair and you remember the hand that once did the same, and how it never returned. And you smile, not with joy, but with knowing, because even pain becomes familiar if it visits often enough. Even absence can feel like company if you make room for it. Sometimes a love ends quietly. No betrayal, no fire, just two people looking at each other and realizing they no longer fit into the same season. The way leaves fall. Not suddenly, not all at once, but one by one, until the tree is bare and still standing. And that, too, was a kind of heartbreak. The kind a cobbler might feel when his wife no longer laughed at his stories. The kind a washerwoman might carry when her husband began to look out the window more than he looked at her. But there was no language for that then. No songs about drifting apart. Just the work of days. The churning of butter. The feeding of pigs. The mending of hems that would be worn for years by people who never knew what had been lost in the stitching. Still, the human heart held on. Through all the leaving, all the endings, all the breakups that weren't called breakups because there was no such word. Only sorrow, and silence, and the ache of memory returning at inconvenient times. By the stream, in the chapel, at the market, when a stranger's voice reminded you of someone you once knew so well, you'd forgotten how much you remembered. And yet, even in the pain there was beauty, because to be broken meant you had loved. To miss someone meant they had mattered. And to carry their name in your thoughts, even after the world told you to forget, was a quiet rebellion. A small act of keeping something sacred in a world that tried to move on too quickly. The truth is, not all medieval heartbreak was tragic. Some partings made way for peace. Some losses taught gentleness. Some absences were the reason people grew into who they needed to become. And so, in the stories we've shared, the noblewoman who wrote letters she never sent, the peasant who forgot her lover's name but not the ache, the monk buried under a stranger's title, the beekeeper's son left behind at the border, their grief was real. But so was their love, and that love never disappeared. It lived in shadows, in lullabies, in bread recipes passed down 4 generations later, with no one remembering where they came from, only that they mattered. It lived in quiet choices, like choosing not to speak ill, like tending a grave that no one else visits, like placing a ribbon in a drawer every year, even when your hair turns white and your hands no longer remember who it was tied for. It lived in the silence between words, the pauses, the prayers, the soft moments when you catch yourself staring into the middle distance and realize your heart is remembering something it never told your mind. This is what the medieval world teaches us, that heartbreak is not a flaw, it's not a failure, it's a thread, woven through life again and again, sometimes fraying, sometimes breaking, but always finding its way back into the cloth. So when you hear an old song and feel your chest tighten, when you wake from a dream where someone long gone smiled at you, when you light a candle for someone who will never know, you are not foolish, you are not weak, you are simply human. And even in the year 1224 or 1327 or 1479 they were too. And that is the most beautiful part of all. Because though the castles crumbled and the names were forgotten, the feelings remained. Whispered through generations, held gently in poems, sewn into hymns, carried in the bones of those who came after. You are not alone in your heartbreak. You never were. Not then. Not now. and never again.